Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Melody Barnes. I'm the chair of the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions, and I want to say how thrilling it is to be here in New Orleans with all of you and the Collective Impact Forum. I know that we've got funders out there and backbone leaders out there and OYIF partners and grantees and so many important stakeholders. And as I said, it's exciting to be here because when I look out at you, I think this is what a movement looks like. And that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And obviously, it also could not be more timely. Many of the communities that we are in are dealing with some of the deepest, thorniest challenges that are facing our country today. We know that, and we live that. We have experienced it, and many of us have been working on these issues across, well, I'll own it, and I just had my 51st birthday. We've worked on these issues for decades. And at the same time, many people are turning on their television sets. They're going to Instagram or Pinterest or YouTube, Twitter, and they're seeing and experiencing these issues for the first time. But because we know it and we live it, we know that these issues are not new, but we also know that the solutions have been elusive. And that's why it is so important that we are gathered here over the course of this week, aligning the work of the Collective Impact Forum and the Social Innovation Fund and the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund and all of the deep and important work that you all are doing in your communities. And in spite of the fact that the challenges often are tough and hairy, and the solutions, as I said, seem elusive, I am not pessimistic. In my house, my husband calls me, "Let a smile be your umbrella," and I call him, "A smile is just a frown turned upside down." So, you know, I tend to see things at least half full, but I'm not pessimistic because of the work that you're doing in your communities, and because we are here and we have focused on building and strengthening collective impact as a model and as a way forward. But in doing that, and this is the focus of this morning, we have to make sure that it is collective impact that's smartly executed. And so that's how we get to this morning's speaker, Angela Glover Blackwell. And I'm thrilled to say that Angela has been a good friend for many, many years. I can't think of a time when I haven't known Angela. But about 4 years ago, she put an idea on the table, and when I say table, I mean a big national table, with regard to equity. And she told us that equity had to be central to all of the work that we are doing, and it has to be central to the way that we move forward. And she said that to those working on the grassroots level, to all of us who are also working in the White House. And we heard her, and we took that in. And I also had the privilege to spend some time with Angela and others as she started to work on and to develop and to polish and to refine these ideas. So I know how deeply she cares about them and how much she has to share with us today. Many of you in the room also know Angela, so her experiences are familiar to you. Her time at the Rockefeller Foundation, her time building and leading the Oakland Urban Strategies Council. She is a frequent commentator, she's an author, she's a lawyer, she's done so many things. But I think the reason why it's such a privilege to have her here with us today is because of her deep work in communities and her commitment to communities over such a long period of time. If we are developing and refining collective impact as the way that we are going to deal with these thorny, hairy, complicated challenges, we have to know and we have to face the fact that it's essential that we put equity squarely on the table as we're doing this work. It cannot be an afterthought. It can't be an add-on. It can't be the, oh yeah, right, equity. It has to be central to this work. Because if we're going to understand and address the womb to prison pipeline, we have to understand and we have to deal with issues of equity. If we're going to understand why bad food makes its way in our communities, but somehow miraculously it's so tough to get good food into our communities, we have to understand and we have to deploy equity. If we're going to understand the disparities to our healthcare system, physical and mental, and the needs in our community, we have to use an equity lens. And if we're going to understand why resources don't make their way into our schools, and people are still saying, well, why can't those children learn? Why aren't those kids successful? Then we have to make sure that equity is central to our work. You know, back in 2008, and Angela and I were just talking about politics, and I was on the campaign in 2008, and you do some interesting things when you're on a campaign. So I spent a weekend in a van with Ashley Judd campaigning in Missouri. And in addition to campaigning for the president, we decided as a side we were going to try and find the best pie in Missouri, but that's another story. But place after place that we went to, I would hear Ashley say, if you're going to keep on doing what you've done, you're going to get what you got. So if we don't use equity as our framework and as our lens, it will be impossible for us to get different outcomes. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're going to have this discussion. And that is why there is no better person than Angela Glover Blackwell to start us off this morning. So welcome, and please help me welcome Angela to the stage.
Well, good morning. I am so happy to see so many of you out for this particular conversation. This is really exciting. And I just want to start off by sharing with you an experience that I had in Oakland, California that I think has real relevance for what it is that you're doing here. This was back in the late 80s or the early 90s, and I was at the Urban Strategies Council then, where Junius is now. And one of the things that we did was we started off, this will sound so old school, because we moved so far beyond this, but we started off putting data using GPS to be able to actually show where kids were concentrating. And we started disaggregating the data by race. And we looked at all the things that impact children in their development. One of the things that we did was we disaggregated by race and place the infant mortality rates in Oakland, California. And what we found when we did that is that there were neighborhoods in Oakland where the infant mortality rate was 3 to 4 times what it was nationally. And the difference between the infant mortality rate in the white community and the black community is really quite astounding. The community really got energized around understanding this data, thinking about a way to solve this problem in Oakland, California, and to be able to come together and make it a high priority. At the same time that the Urban Strategies Council put out this data, the head of healthcare services for Alameda County, the county in which Oakland sits, his name is Dave Kears, decided that he was really going to make this an important issue for the healthcare agency. Dave Kears was an extraordinary leader. What Dave did is that he pulled together all of the community actors that would have anything to do with solving this problem. And the Urban Strategies Council worked directly with him in framing and setting this table and setting the agenda and beginning to figure out how we're going to talk about this. And to this table came the faith leaders, the neighborhood leaders, the education leaders, the social service providers, people from social work and probation. Everybody came to this table. We met around a huge table where at least 65 people would show up for the meeting every time we met. It was amazing to have that many people sitting around, looking at the data, understanding what was going on. The private physicians who worked in the community, most of whom were Black, were sitting around that table with the people who were running the community clinics. The first thing that happened was that the people who ran the Asian Health Center and the Latino Health Center said, this data says we have not been spending the money properly that's been coming into our community. Because what would happen is they'd send out data about where the problems were, would come into the county, and then the county would just spread it across the community. All of the agencies got equal amounts. They said infant mortality is not a problem in the Asian and in the Latino community. And it is a huge problem in the Black community. Know that we are here as your partners, and the only thing we will do with our resources, if you want us to, is to help in the Black community, or we will give up the resources so they will all go directly to the clinics and the other groups that are working on the problem. The churches said, we're right in the neighborhoods where infant mortality is the biggest problem. We're in touch with the families, or we ought to be. How could we begin to have community baby showers? How could we begin to put some of the women in the church in touch with young mothers or in touch with to-be mothers to make sure that we get on top of this problem? A whole bunch of things like that happen. It could be a long story, but you get the feel of it. You get the feel of it. So what happened was that this data, this collective group, this collaborative, this focus on a result, put Oakland in a perfect position when the federal Healthy Start applications came down and communities were invited to be able to apply for a substantial amount of money to reduce infant mortality by 50%. Of course, Oakland applied with the complete support of all this apparatus. Of course, they got one of the grants. And of course, Oakland, California was the first city of all the Healthy Start communities to reduce infant mortality by 50%. The first city. They came together because there was an authentic problem that the community identified as the community. They came together to be able to identify that problem and use the data to be able to inform their strategies. They pulled together everybody who was touching the problem and allowed people to be able to use whatever was their knitting to make their contribution, but to be clear about what they were contributing to. They constantly were looking at data to see how are we doing, where do we need to do something different. They worked with community-based organizations as full partners, which is hard for government agencies, but as full partners. They celebrated as they were making progress, but they did not celebrate too much until the job was done. They pulled in somebody from the community who had run one of the health clinics. Her name was Mildred Thompson to lead the effort, and I'm proud to say that here, so many years later, Mildred Thompson works for me at PolicyLink, and she leads the PolicyLink Center on Health Equity in Place, so that we continue to build on her extraordinary knowledge. I think that that story has in it many of the elements that I know you all must be struggling with as you think about how to move forward. That really is a story about equity. And when I use the term, what I mean is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And the work of equity is to create the conditions that enable that to happen. Create the conditions that enable that to happen. Now, I don't know what you're working on. I haven't looked at a list of all the issues, but I'm sure every issue you're working on is based on the notion that some people are being left behind. Whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's employment, whether it's incarceration, whatever it might be, you have some people who are not able to participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And for every single individual within the group that you might be focused on, there's an individual story. And every group has a group story. And you can't really come up with a strategy that's going to make a difference to allow all to participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, if you don't have a way of tapping into that story, of tapping into that journey. And so equity really is nothing other than what you know is common sense, which is that if you want to achieve a goal, and if people have to be involved in achieving that goal, you have to be able to look at the circumstances, the story, the abilities, the aspirations, and align your strategies with that reality. If you have children, and certainly if you have more than one, you know that each one presents in a different way. And you also know that you hold the highest outcomes for all of them. But when you think about how to achieve that outcome, you do different things because you understand those children in different ways. The larger society is just the same. You hold an outcome, you will have to do different things depending on circumstance. To me, the best context in which to really get a deep understanding of equity is to think about it in the context of education. Because we know that what we want for our children and our young people from education is that all will achieve at high levels, graduate, and go on to reach their full potential in careers that allow them to be full contributing, full participant partners in the larger society. So if that's what we want, this is not a conversation about equality, is it? And that's often how we think about education, and think about equality of education. And we're thinking that people ought to have the same books, they ought to have the same curriculum, they ought to have teachers with the same amount of training, they ought to go to school the same amount of time. Well, that may not produce the result that we want, because once you lay out the result of graduating, reaching your full potential, going on to a career, you have to back into what the inputs might have to be. You might have to do the kind of work that they've done in Harlem, at the Harlem Children's Zone, where they don't say that we're trying to do things equally. We're trying to make sure that all children achieve what they need. Some will need more time in school. Some will need teachers that have a different kind of preparation. Some will need to spend more time working with parents. Because we have been engaged in a multiple decades long experiment in this country. And people who have had the resources have come to the conclusion that you cannot depend on school alone to make sure that children have everything they need. They need to have summer enrichment programs, they need after-school programs, they need to be healthy, they need to have support at home. And so if that's what's needed, why do we leave that only for families that can afford to do it? At the Harlem Children's Zone, they say if that's what children need, we're going to make sure that this effort provides it. Once we set a goal of what it is we want, we have to back into what the inputs need to be, and they probably do not need to be equal. They need to be what's needed given the circumstance. Think about equity in that way. So if you think about equity in that way, we run right into the problem that has been the hardest of this nation. It predates the founding of the nation, and that has been racism. That we live in a nation in which the racism was baked into the society before the nation was born. No wonder it's hard. No wonder it's uncomfortable to talk about it. But when you begin to look at the circumstances that have us where we are, we have to understand the role that racism has played. And that term racism so often is associated with people who are black in America. But racism extends well beyond that. Think about this. Years ago, we reformed welfare in America. And we reformed it on the image of a black woman with many children. Who, there were other things, I don't even want to conjure up all that imagery for you, because you know what it was. We reformed welfare on the image of that woman. But if you are a black woman with children who falls on hard times and you have to reach out and get support, that same system impacts you. If you are a Latina and you fall into needing to have support in the form of welfare, that same system impacts you. So the imagery that gets baked into our policy making impacts everybody. And so it's not just that we have to lift up these systems for achieving racial equity for people who are Black. We have to lift up these systems to fully tap the potential of the nation. Because what we have done, because of unaddressed images, unaddressed stereotypes, unaddressed bias, has put us in a position as a nation that no longer serves us well. Let me say a word about that. You know that we are rapidly becoming a nation which the majority will be people of color. Very soon. By 2042, 2043, 2044, people don't know exactly what the date is, but it's one of those dates. You know that that's going to happen. What you may not know is ever since 2012, the majority of all babies born in this country are of color. That we are at a point where the majority of children in this country under 5 years old are of color. By the end of this decade, and I always say we are going through this decade like a hot knife through soft butter. By the end of this decade, the majority of all children in the United States of America, 18 and under, will be of color. By 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. When I say of color, I mean people who are Native American, Asian, Latino, African American, some combinations, other. And within each one of those groups, we find that there are people who are disproportionately being left behind. You know the data. I don't need to conjure it up. I'm not even going to do the disparities data for you. You know the data. Now, what happens to the cohort of people of color will determine the fate of the nation. So the equity agenda, making sure that all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, while it continues to be a moral imperative, has also become an economic and a national imperative. If we're going to have a democracy that is anything to be proud of on the world stage, it has to work in the context of that vast diversity. If we're going to have an economy that actually allows for the nation to be prosperous, it is going to be because the entrepreneurship, the innovation, the leadership, the contribution of workers is going to come from the cohort of people of color. And even though we talk about 2043 being the time when we become a nation which the majority of people of color, the real reality of who's leading comes much sooner. The median age for people who are white in America is 42. The median age for people who are Latino, and that's the fastest growing group, is 27. It's 27. And we're seeing that the increases in the Latino population, this is very true in Los Angeles and California, it comes from births, it's not coming from immigration. It's inevitable. It's where the youth is. It's where the thing that nations really pride themselves on, being able to have a young population. It's all coming from this change. So it is a gift. It's a gift. It is not a problem. It is a gift. At a time when many other countries are worried about their Asian population, the one here is so young. At a time when we are in a truly global economy, what could be more important than having people in your country who are connected to the globe by language, by culture, by kinship, by friendship? What could be better in a global economy than to have people who are becoming the majority, who are hungry to apply their innovation and be entrepreneurs? People of color are 3 times as likely to start businesses as people who are white. The entrepreneurial spirit that the nation needs is there. It is a gift. It is a gift. It is a gift that will only be tapped if we ask, how do we make sure that all can reach their full potential? The equity agenda has become a national and an economic imperative as well as a moral imperative. So when you think about collective impact, Melanie got it right. You can't think of equity as an afterthought because you are doing the work to build the nation. You have to think about it as what we are all doing. So that this notion of having a common agenda is the beginning point of you have to have a common agenda that actually can think in context. That common agenda has to be in context, the context of who is being left behind. What is their race? What is their gender? What is their ethnicity? What is it about the place that they live that hinders them in terms of being able to have access to everything that they need? In America, where you live is a proxy for opportunity. In America, where you live is a proxy for opportunity. It determines everything. It determines whether or not you get to go to a good school. It determines whether or not you're lucky enough to own a home, whether you have any value you can pull out of it. It determines whether or not you live near a job or near a natural job network. And if I had asked you to raise your hand and asked you where you got your first job, it's because you knew somebody. You knew a family member or a cousin or an uncle or a neighbor who was able to get you to a job. That's a natural job network. Where you live determines that. If you live in a place where nobody's working, you don't have access to a natural job network. Where you live determines whether or not there's a public transportation system that can connect you to opportunity throughout the region. Where you live even determines how long you live. You tell me your zip code and I can tell you your life expectancy. It even determines how well you live while you live in terms of asthma and heart disease and diabetes and all of those things. So when you're thinking about a common agenda, you've got to put it in context. This notion of where you live determining almost everything has to do with a long history of discrimination. People don't just happen to live in communities that lack all of the basics. People were forced to live there. Those were the only places people were allowed to live. It was the only places where people could buy homes if they had the resources to be able to do so. It was by law, it was by policy, and we are still feeling the impact of it. I had the honor to teach a course on race and American cities just this past semester. And one of the students was just shocked to go back and look at the redlining map in the city that he was reviewing. And there were maps. It wasn't just a mental map, they were written down. These are the areas that we redline. You may not sell property there to black people. You may not rent people to people who are black. You may not make mortgages available, all kinds of things, redlining. He was shocked when he took the redlining map and overlaid it with the poverty map and the race map. And it was almost exactly the same all these decades after. The notion that this stuff didn't just happen, it happened because we were shamefully unfair at every level of the nation, and we placed people at a disadvantage. So when you think about coming up with a common agenda, it can't just be looking at the impact of all the wrong that has happened. We have to understand the wrong that has happened. And we have to think about all of the implications of that as we're going forward. We need to put it in the context of achieving equity, put it in the context of understanding the role of race in having it not having been available for all of this time. And we have to be prepared to work with the people who are going to work on the problem deeply, deeply. Another story I want to tell you. Again, it's an Oakland story. In Oakland, we have had, you have to ask Junius whether or not it's improved. I hope it's improved. But we have had a lot of challenges in terms of our public school system. We got to a point where the public school system was not able to even attract a superintendent. They had asked about 2 or 3 people to come and be the superintendent, and they had declined because there was just so much wrong. The Urban Strategies Council again joined with the community and said, stop it. This is embarrassing. Stop trying to go out and get somebody before you look inward and come up with a plan and a strategy for how you're going to improve the school system. If you had a plan that was authentic, that the community was behind, we guarantee you that plan will attract superintendents from all over the country who will want to come and work in your community. We went to the school board with that story, and we got the school board to accept that they would stop looking. They would work with the community to be able to understand what the school system needed, come up with a plan, and use that to go forward. They relied on the community to lead this process. And the community led the process by talking with the community. What we did was we had meetings all over Oakland. We met with, in every session, we didn't ask people to come to us. We went to the communities and had meetings to pick up and analyze exactly what was needed. From that, we created a document called Good Education in Oakland, an agenda for positive change. And the school board members and the mayor and everybody began to use that agenda to be able to plan how to go forward. We then went back to the school district and we said, we can't come up with a plan if you haven't disaggregated your data and had everybody in the building look at it. And we got PG&E, our local energy company, to make their learning and training center available. And in making it available, we brought teams from every school in the district that included parents, teachers, principals, food service workers, janitors, because that's the school community. And each school went into a room and looked at their data on the wall, their data disaggregated by race, and said, this is what you need to work on. They came up with individual plans, moved into one plan. That one plan then went back to the school board, they approved it, they attracted a superintendent who was very good. He did not stay. No one ever does. That's why that's juniors where we are now. So this story does not have as happy an ending as the infant mortality one. But what is important about this story is that we knew that we had to focus on the data. People had to own it, they had to understand it, they had to plan from it. That when you think about being able to share data, it doesn't just mean that you come in and you look at it. You have to share it for a purpose. You have to understand it at your gut. You have to apply it to real people in the community. You have to use it to ask how you're doing. All of those things about sharing data have to come back to disaggregating the data. Once you disaggregate it, to develop different lines of work, depending on where it is you need to go. Very important to be able to get out of this notion of, we've got our data. When I have done work in communities, what I often find is some of the most important people for being able to make a difference are the people who gather the data for all of the agencies. And rarely does anybody ask them to come to a policy table. Rarely does anybody ask them to come to a visioning table. Rarely does anybody say, you have to be a part of this because your input is going to be so important. Being able to pull in people who gather the data as part of it forces them to look beneath the numbers, to say, what does it say? So getting into what does it say is going to be so essential. That when you look at this notion of mutually reinforcing activities, that's where, if you haven't done it right in the beginning, if that common agenda didn't really embrace the equity agenda, the racial nuance, you're not going to have the right people working in the right ways on what's going on. That as we look out across the nation, where we're making a difference is where people are engaged in activities that they understand. They understand what it has to do with anything. In the Promised Neighborhoods programs happening now, inspired by the Harlem Children's Zone, but some people are so into their work and making such extraordinary progress that sometimes they even forget that they were inspired by the Harlem Children's Zone. They were inspired by the needs in their neighborhoods. They were inspired by their collective sense that we have to do something about this. And in those neighborhoods, like in Minneapolis with the North Side Achievement Zone, what we see is that the right people are engaged because they know the problem cannot be solved if they are not engaged. And that means parents are engaged, but they're not just there to be able to help on fundraising. They're not just there to be able to say, we've got community engagement, right? They are there because they have an essential role to play in their children's education, and they're playing that role. The business community understands why they're there. The faith community understands why they're there. Having people really engaged because they buy into the vision is how you really build that collective table. When I was actually, amused is the wrong word, but it's something like amused, when I first heard the term collective impact being put forward as a new concept, Because these stories that I'm telling you that go back a long way or way before that got put forward, what we said we were doing was community building. And what we meant by community building is that we were working on the problems in community, understanding that authentic engagement and building collaborations and using data and leaving the community stronger than it was before it began, all of that had to be part of it. We came up with the definition of community building, and this was in the 80s, so this is a long time ago. And this is what it was, community building. Continuous, self-renewing efforts by residents and professionals engaged in collective action that results in improved lives, greater equity, and new standards and expectations for life and community. That was our definition. Continuous self-renewing efforts. Obviously, community building could not stop when the funding stopped, couldn't stop when a leader left. We had to do the work in a way that would be continuous, and it would self-renew with problem after problem, challenge after challenge presented. Engaged in collective action, because that's the only way that residents and professionals could work together. We called out residents because if residents don't own it, it's not authentic. We called out professionals because it's hard work. And we need to understand that and understand that all the professional acumen that is needed for this work. But what does it result in? It results in improved lives, but also greater societal equity, because just improving life, if we're not changing the context in terms of power, in terms of policy, in terms of politics, it's not going to be continuous and self-renewing and sustainable. And one of the most important things that happens is this notion of new standards and expectations of life and community. Once community has solved a problem collectively, where people know that their input is absolutely essential, there's a new standard for how we work here. There's a new expectation for what it means to be able to do this work well so that it gets better. And those standards and expectations inform the next effort and the next effort and the next effort. People in community who work on these issues discovered outcomes and results a long time ago, because that's what they need. People don't want to see people come into the community and just work on it. They want to see you come into the community and solve it. People don't want to see a report come out of it. They want to have a different level of well-being by the time it's over. People don't want to take time away from their busy, demanding lives where they don't have enough time to do the things they know they want to do just to be able to be somebody's head count at a meeting. They want it to result in change. The community thrives on a commitment to results. You can't come into a community and tell the community that they've got to be committed to results. What else are they going to be committed to? What else are they going to be committed to? There are so many people that devoted their lives to working in community, often for no pay or little pay, because that's just the kind of people they are. If they've been doing that just to say I worked on it, they were focused on results. They were focused on results, and they were doing it with others because they know that's the only way that you can achieve something. I say to the staff at PolicyLink, if ever we come up with something we're working on that we can do by ourselves, we need to go back to the drawing board. The only thing worth doing is the thing that you can do and must do with others. And so it is so important for those of you who are engaged in collective impact to know when you're doing it right, you join a community that has been waiting for you. They have been waiting for you to get it. They have been waiting for you to understand that that's the only thing that's going to make a difference. And when you come, you have to come with the humility to know that the people in community know a lot more about this than you do. And if you think you're going to get it right without tapping their wisdom, you are wrong. But if you think you're going to get it right without tapping their energy, you are wrong. If you think that you're going to get it right without tapping their ability to hold the systems accountable that have to change, you are wrong. Community lives this. They got skin in the game. They got skin in the game. If you don't get results, you probably still have a good school your kids can go to. You probably still have a house that you can return to. You probably still have a job that you do. But if you don't get it right, the people who get skin in the game suffer. So do not think for a minute that you have discovered this. And do not think for a minute that you are the only ones who care about outcomes. I don't think anything offends people in community more than to have people who don't live there, who don't know their story, come in and say, well, now we're going to really do this right. Now we're going to really get some results. Now we're going to really try to bring in the people who have to be in it to get it right. That's what people have been wanting all along. So this notion of equity, and I'm going to end here and hopefully be in conversation with others. This notion of equity has to be fundamental. It challenges all of us to be clear about the context in which change has to happen. But when we think about equity, equity as a term can apply to anything. Just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Sometimes people are not reaching their full potential because of the context in which people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans are trying to do their work. Sometimes we are not all participating because people with disabilities are not able to fully participate. Sometimes it has to do with people who are Native American not being able to have access to all that they need, not being able to get out of this cradle or prison pipeline and get into a cradle career pipeline. The data on Native Americans and incarceration is worse than that for African Americans, for Black people. Sometimes it's because of language. Sometimes it's because of immigration status. Sometimes it's because of race. If you aspire for all and you understand the specificity and the nuance that it takes for all, you can always apply the equity lens. You can always have that conversation. And once you start having the conversation, you know who has to be in it. Thank you for your work.